Even though I'm 85, I am still relevant. My name is Dorthaan Kirk, and I turned 85 July 13th this year. 85 and counting. Who am I? I am the person that I believe the higher being intended to do what I've done all of these years in jazz and art and culture. When I became one of the original founders of WBGO, I could never have dreamed I would be a founder. I knew absolutely nothing about radio. All I knew was to turn it on, turn it off, change the channels. That came to me from a friend that knew the radio station was starting, and he recommended me. There's a documentary on WBGO, and in the documentary, and they kept it in there, they didn't edit it out. I thought he was simply out of his mind to recommend me. Why? Because I knew nothing about radio. As it turns out, I was perfect for the vision they had for WBGO. Sorry I took the scenic route, but who I really am, you met my great-granddaughter earlier. And when people talk to me about all the jazz things I've done and give me all of these accolades, I appreciate them. But the way I see myself as being mommy, Nana, in the kitchen with no makeup, making one of my kids or great-grandkids or whatever favorite dish, out in the yard playing with the kids. Yesterday, we were on the patio in the back cooking out, even though it's October, the weather's beautiful. That's my comfort zone. The New York Times did a big article on me. I have it framed and in the hallway out there. One of the people that they interviewed about me was John Schreiber. And he said, he just made it up for the interview. She's the first lady of jazz in Newark, and it stuck. I have known John, I can't remember how many years now, but he was a young person out of college, went to work for George Wein and his festival productions. John learned this business from the bottom up and from the very best. He used to be tour manager for artists such as Dorthaan Kirk and travel on the road with them. And of course, I traveled on the road with him as well. So I've known John, and it was fun but embarrassing. At one of the concerts, when he started the T.D. James Moody Jazz Festival, he was on stage in Prudential Center. And he was talking about upcoming events, and he mentioned what I was doing in relationship to the festival, and he stood up there and told the whole hall. I've known her over 40 years, I mean, it was true. And he also said the same thing when NJPAC honored me when I retired from WBGO in 2018. Yeah, so John is one of my heroes. NJPAC couldn't have hired a better person to take over after Larry Goldman left. Perfect, he's absolutely perfect, yes. I grew over the years as the station grew. Again, I was the third person hired there. I don't know if you know this, but you might since you were a teacher. WBGO was formerly owned by the Newark Board of Education. Do you know that story? Oh my, I have to, if you still have a DVD player, you must look at it. I have extra copies upstairs. Anyhow, I started with WBGO when it was on the 4th floor of Central High School. I will try and tell you as simply as I can, but I urge you to look at the DVD. Bob Ottenhoff, who was the person that came up with the idea of WBGO, he used to work at the Office of Newark Studies at Rutgers. Are you familiar with that?
Yeah.
They did a study that pretty much said WBGO was not being utilized to its fullest by the Board of Education. Bob Ottenhoff suggested WBGO be a traditional straight-ahead jazz station. The powers that be, and Kenny Gibson was in office at the time. And I didn't know any of these people, but I learned them once I went there. Kenny Gibson, who was the mayor, put his stamp of approval on it. And in 1976, the station was transferred from Newark Board of Ed to Newark Public Radio Incorporated. And so that's how I started out at WBGO. Even though the license wasn't transferred until 1976, it wasn't until 1979 that WBGO moved into its current home at 54 Park Place, better known as 54 Wayne Shorter Way, because the Park Place has been renamed Wayne Shorter Way. I don't know if you know that or not. So it was January 1979, because when I started, which was October of '78, Bob was in the process of choosing a permanent home for WBGO. So he had 3 places in mind. One was in West Orange, one was an old furniture store on Central Avenue, and you know all that's changed now. And the other was its current home. WBGO bought that building in 1979 for $125,000. You can do the research. It's worth millions now. It's worth millions, yes. I started out first as the receptionist. And by the way, I was only working 4 hours a day, and I was making $2.50 an hour. You can go back to 7 and 9. Anyhow, as WBGO grew, different things started to happen. So I became the assistant to the music director, and they called me the music coordinator. Why was that? Because having traveled on the road, I'm the one that knew all of the musicians. I knew the record company people. I knew the concert producers and all of the people on the other side of the music industry that WBGO was going to need to call on. There's an article that George Kanzler wrote many years ago. I'm sure you might remember George Kanzler, that used to write the jazz columns for the Star Ledger. I still have some of those articles. He would always say, I gave WBGO credibility. At the time, he said she gives them credibility. And also the same person that recommended me to WBGO, Steve Robinson. By the way, we're still in touch. Matter of fact, he was here to visit me a few weeks ago, even though he lives in Boston. It's in the video. You'll appreciate the video, and I would gladly give you one. He also said in the video, Bob didn't have the credibility, but I did. So those two people, Bob Odenhoff and Steve Robinson, were the first people I met, and I will give you their connection. They both worked in radio. Steve lived in Boston. He had been a close friend and fan of Rahsaan's before he died. They met on a bus in Chicago going to a convention. Bob Odenhoff told Steve Robinson he was starting this radio station, and the rest is history. It's all in the documentary. As a child, I grew up in Houston, Texas. When I grew up, and this is really going to date me, Spencer and Ashley won't have a clue about this. When I left Houston in 1955 and went to LA to go to college, which I never finished, but that's a whole story unto itself. My mother didn't even have a TV. I grew up listening to the radio. And back then, you had R&B on the radio, you had gospel, you had all forms of jazz, and they won't relate to this either, but I grew up with country and western. It was what the music was when I grew up. I finished high school a few months before I turned 17, and I had older friends, older being 18, 19, 20, and they used to quote unquote dress me up and smuggle me into jazz clubs. So much like the music, the hip hop and so on, rap is the music for the young people today. That's what I grew up on. I didn't know it was America's art form and all those fancy things. I, of course, later became to know that, but it was what you did. You didn't know anything different. It was your music. Everybody loves Felix Hernandez. Matter of fact, I have friends that don't know anything about the other parts of BGO, but they know Felix Hernandez. I think in those days, the artists really had something to play about, and it came out in their music. For an example, with jazz players, they had segregation to deal with. They weren't flown everywhere. They traveled on buses, etc., etc., etc. They sometimes had to double up in hotel rooms because of budget reasons, and so on and so forth. And so their personal lives came out in the music that they played. And that could be a whole conversation, but that's briefly. You've just hit a sore subject. My mother played piano in church, and I always wanted to play the piano. My grandmother sold that piano, and I was mad at her from a little girl for years, because my mother, for whatever reason, never bought one to have in our house, and I blame her for me not taking piano as a kid. I'm the oldest of 5. I had 2 younger brothers. One died in his sleep and one was murdered when he was 23 over a darn leather jacket and something else. I don't know if I ever got over that, because at the time he was our sweetheart. Even though my sister is the baby of the family, he was the sweetheart of the family. when I heard it growing up in Houston, you knew who the leader was, you knew that. But once I met him, you learned who the side persons were. I never cared about that. Why would I? You learned the intricacies of it. And one of the first things he did was bought me, and it's down there on the bottom shelf, This Business of Music by William Krasovsky. And then after that, there were several editions, and he made me read that book. I had no idea what I was reading, what it all meant, what is BMI, what is ASCAP, what is this, that, and the other, what is it, what does it mean to have your own publishing company, etc., etc. However, as I traveled around with him and also going to recording sessions, seeing how it worked, how he chose the compositions, were they written by him, somebody else whose publishing company are they going in, etc., etc., etc. That's when I like, oh, so when something would happen and I didn't understand it, I would refer to those books. They down there on the bottom shelf. I remember where I found them. We moved into this house July 22nd, 1974. We had these shelves built. When Rahsaan died, all of these shelves were completely filled with albums. In his will, because he has a son by a previous marriage, he left his albums to his son. And so according to the will, because when he died, his son was 13, I was to turn over whatever to his son. He left his albums and his instruments to his son, of which I, of course, with the will and the lawyers, turned that over. The albums that you see here and the ones over there I need to file. I collected myself once I started working for WBGO. Again, I had more, but I just had so much stuff at some point. I decided to keep just the special ones. So that's what those are. So I read a lot in airports, on the airplane, and we've had some really, really long flights. I guess my very longest flight must have been from LA to Tahiti. Then we boarded a plane from Tahiti to Auckland, New Zealand, and from Auckland, New Zealand to Australia. Actually, we had a 2-day stay over in New Zealand, and that was, of all the places I've ever been, Australia was my favorite. I have photographs in some of those books up there are filled with photographs, and there's some others on the floor there. That's some of the stuff I did during COVID. I was not bored during COVID. Anyhow, the Australian trip was special because I got to meet the Aborigines. Yeah. The one thing I wanted the concert promoter to do is take me to the Aborigines. I did my research before I left here in an encyclopedia, not on the internet. I still have my children's World Book encyclopedias in a box upstairs, and I don't want to put them outside because I can't, and I haven't found anywhere to donate them. But anyhow, I had done my research, and the Aborigines are very, very, very interesting people. I don't know if things have changed there, because that was in 1974, I believe, when we went there. But they were interesting because here I am wanting to know all about their lives, and they really, really, really wanted to know about our lives as African Americans and how we live. So to share a little part of my visit with you, other than going to this park and with the koala bear and getting Rasan to hold it and take pictures. That's their native animal. I don't know if you all know that. Of course, when we were in Sydney, I wanted them to come to the concert. I was done to the fact that they weren't allowed there. And so, to make a long story short, I finally figured it out. I don't remember how the concert promoter told me they couldn't come, but they ended up having a little reception party for Rasan and his group at one of their arts facilities with music and everything, and I got to visit their house. I will tell you one thing, even though they were isolated down by the water, I'm gonna say the beach, and I can't remember what it was called, they take good care of them because their housing is, you can't even compare it to where people with not a lot of income here live. And I remember when the driver was taking us out there, because I went, Rasan went, and some of the members of his band, but I don't remember who they are, it's not important. Anyhow, I remember him having a hint of envy in his voice about some of the Aborigines live better than them. So it was very, very prejudiced back then, and it's their country. Even though I'm 85, I am still relevant, and I'm going to tell you why. I told WBG, now that COVID has somewhat lifted, my surgeon that I go to every 6 months just told me yesterday he had it twice, and the most recent, he said, this one wasn't bad. I'm like, you damn doctor. But anyhow, WBGO started its children's concert series that I produced. Now that COVID lifted, it started in the spring. I created that program way over 25 years ago. And it's a great program because it introduces young people to jazz. And some of the young people that came with their parents, aunties, uncles, or what have you, way back then, have grown up and brought their kids back. So WBGO hired me to bring the series back. And again, we did, in the spring, we did SOPAC, Montclair, Newark Museum and the Newark Library. On the 21st, we are at Flushing Town Hall in Queens, and it's a collaboration with the Louis Armstrong Educational Fund. And you may or may not know, Pops lived in Queens. We've actually presented before at Flushing Town Hall. So I'm relevant. The millenniums don't have some of the stuff up here that's needed that I have. Also, and you probably already know this, John Schreiber still keeps me with NJPAC as a consultant, in addition to their collaborating with Bethany and its Jazz Vespers. These are the events I produce for the festival. November 18th, Cyrus Chestnut at Bethany. November 15th, actually, the film on Louis Armstrong at the Newark Museum. On November 4th, the WBGO Children's Concert will be part of the festival in Victoria Theater. And the one paid event that I produce is Dorthaan's Place, which is in Nico's at 11 and 1 o'clock on November 19th. So I'm still relevant. The advice that I would give them, if they can't go through traditional ways and, quote, put in an application, the best way to get in is get an internship. That's the best way. Recently, and this doesn't really count, but recently, WBGO's marketing person left, and I was thrilled that a young person in her early 20s, Brianna, I think she's from Newark. I haven't physically met her, only through email. She got the job as her assistant through some program in the summer, and when the marketing person left, she was shooed in. Okay. And so, and WBGO used to have an internship program. You can always go to their website. And I imagine most radios and TV stations have that same thing, but that's a great way to get in the door. Because they can see what you can do, your interests, who you are, and if you do well enough, they'll find a way to keep you.